Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
In a time when the notion of having multiple careers before retirement seems to be the norm, there are a few exceptional individuals who have remained steadfast in their chosen path, passionately pursuing their dreams for decades. Today I have the pleasure of hearing from one such person, Bill Hutchins, a veteran TV news anchor who has dedicated an incredible 30 years of his 40-year career to the same station. In an era of fast-paced media and fleeting attention spans, Bill's unwavering commitment to his craft and his station is a testament to the profound impact of local news. Throughout his journey, Bill has embraced the art of communication, recognizing the power of storytelling and the vital role it plays in connecting communities. With a deep love for the written word, he understands the significance of crafting narratives that resonate with viewers, transcending the boundaries of time and place. Here is my conversation with Bill Hutchins. Bill, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here, Dave, and great to see you again.
We want to remind our listeners that this particular episode is being recorded in mid-June of 2023. So you've been in the business for over 4 decades. You've had to do research. You've had to focus on your delivery and your presentation, but I would guess that writing is one of the more important components of what you do.
I would agree with you. You can have the best broadcast voice in the world, but if people don't understand what you're saying, how you're saying it, if your sentence structure is not complete and easy, flows easy, then you've lost the listener, you've lost the viewer. So, and not only that, I mean, we're in the news business, so you have to be accurate, and so that's key, right? People want information. They don't want my opinion. They want information about something that's going on. So you're trying to answer all those questions of the who, what, where, when, why, how, if you can, and present that in a way that is informative.
Mm-hmm. Was writing something you wanted to do early on?
No, broadcasting is what I wanted to do early on.
Okay.
I wanted to be on radio and I wanted to be on TV. The writing is part and parcel with that. That came later because I couldn't really write for broadcast when I was first starting out. And I learned from some really good people at that time. Fortunately, I was able to work in some Toronto radio stations where they had some real pros there. And they taught me a lot about how to write for broadcast. And then I kind of got the bug from that. So then after that, and you get the hang of it, you develop your own technique. Then I started to really gravitate towards the writing. So it is very important, and I still believe that today.
Mm-hmm. Given all your experience covering news on campus radio way back when, writing news stories for those commercial stations in Toronto, and then coming to Kingston, working on television here, reporting and anchoring the news. Over all of that time, has the nature of the news stories that you reported changed much?
I don't think so. The stories have certainly changed. But the way we tell a story is pretty much the same. It should be. Because, again, I go back to basics of storytelling, of getting both sides, if you can, in a story, to have balance. Those are basics you're taught in journalism school and certainly by news directors. And if you don't do it that way, you hear about it pretty fast. So the stories have changed, and certainly social media. I don't know if you want to touch on this later, but that has changed. I mean, that did not exist when I started working with a typewriter and reel-to-reel tape, which you had to splice edit for your sound bites. And, of course, you know all that. And then the technology has evolved by leaps and bounds since then, along with the information flow, where you get the news from. We used to rely on people calling us or faxing us information, and our own reporters who, hear about things that are going on, following stories that way. But now the flow of information is just coming at you so fast through so many different platforms. It's hard to keep up, and it's hard to sort through What's genuine? What's of interest, do you think, to viewers, and what isn't? What's the crap? What's the junk? What's the, as some people would call it, fake news?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's part of our job now. And I did not have to deal with that back in the 80s. In some ways, that is a blessing. I didn't. It was very basic. It was a teletype machine, and you paid for a subscription service to whether it's CP, Canadian Press, or Broadcast News, and your reporters. That's how you gathered news. And people would also mail you letters of story ideas or call the newsroom. But now, like I said, it's just like this constant, never-ending flow of emails and text messages and social media on Twitter and Facebook. We gather a lot of news through those sources as well. So it is a help.
Yeah.
It keeps you in touch, but it can be overwhelming on some days. It's just too much coming at you.
You mentioned typewriters.
Yes.
Turntables and vinyl are coming back. Do you think a typewriter is going to make a return visit?
I hope not, actually. I still type the way I learned on a typewriter. So I'm still pounding a keyboard, and it's like, you don't do that with these kinds of keyboards, right? They're very delicate things. So I've been through a few keyboards as a result of that. But you learn to sort of press the keys hard, right? To make an indent in the copies that you're making, because we would make 3 copies of every story with the what's that stuff you put
carbon
copy?
Carbon,
So
yes.
we would do that.
I remember those days.
So you have to press fairly hard because it was a manual typewriter. I was so happy. I think it was in the first or second year I got started. I got an electric typewriter, so you didn't have to press as hard.
Oh.
That's like, woo, wow. And I got a cell phone too, though it was, the size of a big printer today. It was pretty big with the battery and all that.
And it
that
came
was
with
cool.
a big box. Yeah.
It did. That was all battery too, and it was
Scary.
cool though. It's like, wow. I remember showing my friends and family. I said, "Look at me! I got a cell phone." And then I'd pull out this little suitcase, and here it is. Right? That was fun. But yeah, I'm glad that technology has improved too.
Now, let's get back to listeners or viewers and local news. Do people still care about local news?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Because if they don't, I won't be here for long.
Yeah.
And many of my colleagues. To me, and I think the broadcasters recognize this as well. In fact, I think they have to make a promise of performance to the CRTC and other regulatory bodies that they have to commit to local news from the business side of things, because that's what people care about in this fast-flowing age. You can get a lot of information about what Donald Trump is doing today or what's going on with the war in Ukraine. But what happened at City Hall last night? What about that accident where the train derailed on Bath Road? Is that going to happen again? Are they going to inspect the tracks? What's happening with that housing development that they approved but isn't yet built? What's happening with the homelessness crisis, the opioid crisis in this city? Those are local stories that people gravitate to because it affects them in some way, shape, or form, or they just want to know what's going on in their neighborhood, in their backyard. Are my taxes going up? How much? Why? What do you get for that? These are things you're not going to get in a lot of other national media or any other source. There are other local media, of course, that will cover that, but that's what I think is the strength of local coverage, local where I work, local radio and TV coverage. It has to be. We can't compete with the CNNs and the other CBCs, the big networks like that, in terms of sending reporters around the world. That's not our role. Sure, we have those stories on, but our focus is local, and I think it always will be. It has to be. It's what people. It's one of the reasons they tune in to see us every night.
Over the many years you've been in this business, covering all kinds of different stories, are there any in particular that stick out?
Well, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Which particular category are you looking for? Well, unfortunately, when it comes to news, it's often the bad news that people remember. Where they were, what they were doing, or just the whole sheer shock of it all. I remember, events like the 1998 ice storm, the 2003 blackout. I remember the final Tragically Hip concert in 2016, which attracted like 10,000 people down to Market Square. It was a celebration, but a bittersweet one at that, as you know. I remember going back to Market Square to cover the death of Gord Downey and how they put out tributes and memorials. People wanted a place to gather, reflect, remember, pay tribute. I also remember some high-profile trials, like the Shafia trial, where the 4 women were killed and their bodies dumped in the Rideau Canal. And of course, that went on. That gained national, international attention. So stories like that kind of resonate because of the notoriety, but also because, and like I said, sometimes it's a celebration, and you want to reflect on stories that have a positive outcome as well. So those are the kinds of stories I recall.
So the Shafia story that you mentioned, for those folks who don't live in the Kingston area, this was a family from Afghanistan that came over to Canada, and these 4 women were murdered by the father, the mother, and the older brother, as I recall.
That's right. They were all convicted in a very high-profile trial, which we covered. It was over at the Frontenac County Courthouse, us and every other out-of-town media that showed up as well.
Yeah.
And I recall when those bodies were discovered, it was just before Canada Day long weekend, and we got a tip that there was a car in the canal at the Kingston Mills Locks. And at the time, everyone speculated or thought that it was just, some kids on a joyride dumped a car in a canal. And so we didn't know the seriousness of this at that time, but we sent a camera person out there. And this, again, is before a long weekend. People are gearing up for other things, right, to celebrate Canada Day. And nobody was thinking of this kind of tragedy on this kind of scale. And then so when we sent that camera person up there to get the shots, we soon realized the scope of the news that we were getting, where you could see the 4 tarps laid out on the ground and the bodies had been recovered from that submerged vehicle. And we were the only media organization that had those pictures, which of course every other media organization wanted and continue to play in some way, shape, or form to this day. And it's just one of those stories where you never thought. I mean, the Kingston connection was just happenstance. Because I think they were from Montreal. They went to Niagara Falls, and then they came back and they decided, how are we going to, commit these murders where? They just happened to find the Rideau Canal and do it here. So and that's what put Kingston in the spotlight for a few years over that, and just the sheer tragedy and scale of that is still shocking. And but justice was served. And we covered again the whole trial and the reason for these so-called honor killings, the motive, I mean, and then we saw the justice done, and now the Shafias are in prison.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing what triggers memories of these local stories or stories in general for each individual who hears them. And I can think of that story in particular, and when I do, I remember the fact that the car that was in the Rideau Canal was the same make, model, and color as one we owned at the time. And so that triggers that every time you hear these stories. And I'm sure for other people who are listening who may not be from Kingston, it could be anywhere, and you hear a local story or any kind of story that's a major story, there's something that brings it back to mind from time to time. As a person who reports the news, do you ever get frustrated reporting the same sorts of stories year after year? Like the negative stories, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Bad news just drags everyone down. I mean, believe me, I don't set out on my day to say, what kind of bad news can I find for viewers tonight? I don't start my day like that. But nonetheless, it is what it is. And we are finding ourselves in an increasingly hostile society, I think, and compared to a few years ago. And so it is news, and often it's bad news. And there used to be this slogan, I remember, in Detroit back in the 80s, where they had a radio station, and they were big on crime and sensationalism and that. And they would always, their mantra was, if it bleeds, it leads. That was their mantra. And I never forgot that. That was out of Detroit, but you could hear their signal in Windsor. And, that's the nature of what we do. It's not always happy news. In fact, most of it it's bad, and there's no way to sugarcoat that at all. Well, sometimes there are happy endings or silver linings in some of these stories, but Do I ever get tired of it? Yeah, some days it does wear me down because I look for ways. Fortunately, we have an hour-long TV newscast. So, yes, the first few minutes may not be the greatest. And a little bit later on in the newscast, they may not be very happy stories either. But in the course of an hour long, we can work in some good news stories that make people kind of feel better about things, so it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
So I look for some kind of balance in a show. I don't want to make it all doom and gloom. And putting a newscast together, quite frankly, is subjective. A lot of it is left to me and my colleagues at work to decide the lineup, the order of the stories that we're going to present. And so we look for ways to find some balance in the totality of that newscast. And hopefully, so we're not leaving viewers with just, again, this depressing a newscast day after day, because believe me, it depresses me too. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to make it all bad news. Some days it is what it is, right? You just cannot get away from things coming at you that may not be good at all. But then there are other days, they're few and far between, but there are other days where it's a lot of good news stories. Mm-hmm. You know, something gets stolen from someone and they really need that mobility device. And then someone in the community steps forward and donates it to that person.
Yeah.
You know, those kinds of stories, people really gravitate to it because it has a happy ending. Sure, there was a crime committed at the beginning, but it has a happy ending for the person, the victim. And so we do some of those stories as well. And again, it all comes down to balance when you're putting a newscast together, but also not shirking away from the tough stories that need to be told, and whether people like it or not. And if you don't like it, you can always switch the channel, I suppose. But we try to be fair and balanced throughout the newscast, and we certainly try to get more local stuff as much as we can in there. So, and that's really, again, key to putting a newscast together.
Primarily on the international or national level, from time to time, you'll see some people reporting the news, and at times they will editorialize. And I'm wondering if you think there is any place for editorializing in the context of a local newscast.
I do. We don't do it, I don't think, often enough. I think people want some context. Sometimes you don't get that in a story where there's a lot that's left out for different reasons. We tend to present stories that are balanced, right? That they have both sides in it, and we leave it up to viewers to decide. But often, there's more to that story that you cannot tell in the form of a typical news story. So I think there is an opportunity for more opinionated stories. The only thing is you have to identify that before you launch into an opinion to say, this is my opinion. Now, whether that should be me or someone else is debatable. If I start, spewing my opinions out, you're not going to believe me, especially if you disagree with me. You're not going to really trust my reading of other stories because now you know where I stand on a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if it should be me necessarily, but I think there's always room in a local newscast to comment about why things are the way they are from someone's perspective. Why did City Council vote on that particular issue? Are they being too hard in evicting homeless campers?
Yeah.
Are they being greedy and wanting a 4% property tax increase when they could do it for 2%? Like you can't really get into a lot of that in the form of a 2-minute story.
Yeah.
So there's always, I think, opportunities. In fact, when I read the papers and look, I always look for opinion columns because I want to see what people are talking about, and not just the facts, so to speak, but also the opinions of people. I think that matters.
I want to throw this at you as a newsman. I can't think of a local story, but let's do something international and focus on the coverage that someone like former President Donald Trump gets on the various news media. And I'm thinking of the concept of if he does anything, he gets coverage, and is he getting too much coverage, and are we promoting him by giving him all of this coverage? That argument, I'm sure you've heard.
Yes.
Thoughts on that?
Well, Oh boy, you asking me to wade into the Donald Trump? that is a tough one because again, I'm not here to. I don't really want to spew my opinions about
Okay.
Donald Trump, whether you
Just
like
the
him.
concept of someone getting a lot of coverage and then others watching it, perceiving it as being promotion of that particular story or individual. Do you run that risk in reporting something over and over again?
You do, but at the same time, he is a public figure.
Yep.
And a well-known one at that. And and he's twice indicted, twice impeached, and you cannot shirk away from that. You can't ignore it. Whether we go too far with that coverage, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think in this market, anyway, because I really can't speak for other cities. I don't think in Canada, in general, we give Donald Trump too much or too little coverage. I think we give whatever is happening enough to say this is what's happening today.
Yeah.
In the U.S., though, it's a different story.
Yeah.
It's just like a whole wide open season. Depending on what part of the U.S. you're in, you either get more, you get less, you get slanted coverage, you get biased coverage. So U.S. news is a totally different game than Canadian news. I think we kind of stay out of the muckraking that goes on.
Yeah.
When it comes to Mr. Trump.
Okay. Let's move on to something else and talk about the process of getting the news. And the one story that I can recall when I first started working at CKWS Radio years and years ago, the news department had more people in it. They had a guy who came in after hours and sat at the telephone and phoned all the detachments of the police in the area looking for stories that came up. And I don't know if the fellow was paid or not, but he was a fixture in the news department for a long time. And where do people get stories these days? You mentioned earlier social media was one source for some of your stories.
Well, I remember the person you're referring to. We've all, I think, in our role, have had to do that job. They're called cop checks.
Yeah.
And you used to get in the morning, and you'd call the police, the watch commander. You'd call the fire department. You'd call these people to find out, hey, anything going on that we should know about? Any crimes committed? Any arrests? You had to literally pick up the phone and call them because there was no other way to get that information. And again, as I alluded to earlier, these organizations, most of them have their own communications departments now. And we still call these people, by the way, on occasion to confirm things. But a lot of the information, they present themselves now. They've got their own Twitter accounts and their own Facebook accounts and their own media platforms, their own web pages. So they're almost in the business of presenting their own news. When they're at an accident, for example, they often tweet pictures. The police officer tweets pictures of an accident scene to say, here's what happened, avoid this road. We kind of get upset over that because they won't let us close enough to get those pictures. But because of the nature of their job, they're allowed to get those pictures. And they're playing the news person now by providing the information on their own. Yeah. So they've basically bypassed us and gone right to the community. It's like, wait a minute, that's our job. That's how that's changed. Yeah. And a lot of them are media savvy now. I'm not just singling out police, but there are many other, whether it's City Hall, whether it's the hospitals, the healthcare sector, they all have their communications departments now. And they are very cautious about the messages they want to get out a lot more than ever before. And we have to go through them if we want to talk to some key player. Yeah. You don't just pick up the phone and call the police chief anymore or a doctor you want to speak. You got to go through their communications departments, which is time consuming and a bit of a pain, but hey, I understand what their role is. And years ago, they didn't have that. City Hall didn't have a communications department. If you wanted to talk to a city commissioner or the CAO, you just called them. And you didn't even need to tell them why. Just like, hey, I'm doing a story on this. Well, now you got to explain why you want to talk to them, to the communications, and they decide if, when, and even who is available to talk about that. Mm-hmm. So they throw up a lot of roadblocks. I know it's not intentional, but they do get in the way of us doing our job sometimes, especially if it's a bad news story, because often, you get shut out. And So the process of getting news, as I said, social media, we scan that. We look for what the competition's doing. Everybody does that. If we have a great story, you can bet it's on the competition in a couple of days, and vice versa. But we try to get our own interviews and our own kind of angle to it, and not just verbatim. That's kind of not professional. But other processes, well, like I said, we still get phone calls. We still get emails from concerned residents who see our news, and it's like, hey, did you mention this, or should you mention that, or can you follow up on this? And they basically let us know. It's like, here's another angle that you did not consider or did not know about when you covered the original story. So we'll do a follow-up story. It's like, hey, would you like to talk about what you just emailed us? And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they say, no, I've got a great story for you, but I don't want to go on camera. So it's like, okay, well, we need, that authenticity. We need you saying something. Otherwise, it's just us saying it. And, we need that verification. So that's another way that we get news. And sometimes, I could be driving into work and I see something happening. And I say, hey, let's check this out. What's going on with this? And we just follow that word of mouth. And but the process is some days we'll rely more heavily on social media or news releases. News releases are like, the driest because, and I say that respectfully from the people who send them because it is their job, but they basically spoon feed you of the where to be, what it is.
The way we want to say it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. They try to put their own spin on it. And then, of course, when we show up with a reporter, we put our own angle on it. So it's not always their spin. But so we get news releases and phone calls and our own reporters who are out and about, and they're chatting to someone about one thing. And they said, oh, by the way, did you know this is coming up? It's like, oh, okay, we'll follow that then. We'll do something more on that another day.
Technology has changed quite a bit when it comes to television news, and I'm thinking of the days when a reporter would go out on the scene and they'd have a cameraman with them and they would be shooting shots. And in these days you have reporters who are actually called videographers now because they have their own camera. They set their camera up and they just talk into the camera and they do the story that way.
It's pretty much a one-person show for these videographers now. The industry has brought new technology, which has also led to the loss of jobs along the way because technology has taken their place. Yeah. I'll take you into the studio for a second before I talk about what's happening in the field. In our studio, our broadcast studio, it's a big. You've seen it. It's a big. It's an old bus station actually, but we've got our lights, our studio lights, and the anchor desk and the cameras and all that. And we used to have people behind the cameras, 2 of them at least,
someone
operating
controlling the microphone, the big boom microphones.
Well, we'd have the lav microphones. They'd be controlled in another room. Someone would work the faders. So when you're talking,
I'm going further back than
yeah,
that.
I know you are. That's too far back. But we'd have 2 or 3 people on the floor, so to speak, behind the cameras, directing us during a newscast. We'd have people in the background running tapes. Working the audio board. We'd have a lighting person. We would have floor director. We'd have people behind the scenes running commercials, that kind of thing. They're all gone now. It's crickets in the studio when we are on the air at 6 o'clock every night. It's just the anchors that are there. Everything else is automated. And, the cameras, it's automated. Audio, automated. They've pre-recorded your voice and levels, and they can still ride them manually in the back, but it's all automated, all computer now. Templates is what they call it. Lighting person gone, videotape, you know where that went, right? Don't need that anymore. It's all played through servers and computers. So that's my reality.
Yeah.
It's very quiet out there, actually. You could hear a pin drop in the studio, whereas before it was hustle and bustle, and you'd hear quiet on the set. Yeah, we don't need to say that anymore. It's already quiet, except when we start talking, of course.
Tell the crickets to keep quiet.
Yeah, right. And then out in the field, which is the region that we cover with reporters, yeah, they're a one-person show. We made that switch about 20 years ago to videographers. I know some other stations are just getting around to doing that now, where it's this hybrid role of, yeah, you have to learn how to shoot a camera, you have to learn how to write the story, tell the story, edit the story, do it all yourself. And by the way, you're driving to Belleville tomorrow and doing all that when you get back. So it's very onerous on some days for these reporters to go out in the field in all kinds of weather and sometimes afar, and then come back and do all that themselves. Now, once in a while, we do tag team it. It depends if it's like a high-profile court case and you want to get what they call a perp walk of the suspect being led from the paddy wagon into the courthouse. There's only a few seconds there. You better make sure you're rolling when that happens. So we might send a second camera person there to tag team it. We do that once in a while, but generally speaking, it's whatever the reporter can gather on their own. And we help them, of course, with the ideas, locations, where to interview, things like that. But they're still out there on their own.
So let's get back to the studio for half a second. So these reporters come back and they have their stories that they've recorded somewhere else outside the station. Mm-hmm. They bring them back, they edit them, they process them. What happens to them between that point and the 6 o'clock news? Who puts them together?
They disappear into this netherworld of the internet. They're on a cloud somewhere. Well, they edit on their laptops or desktops.
Yeah.
And it gets dispatched into, again, the internet. It's internet-based. And then what happens in terms of putting the newscast together? So these then are digitized, are loaded into our show through our own templates and what we call Q series, which is lays out the entirety of the newscast, and there are lines in there where you can drop the story in.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but in terms of actual lineup of the show, well, that's part of my job. Not my, I certainly have people who help and are just as good at it. We decide what the lead story is going to be. We decide what the second story and the third story are going. We decide when the weather's coming in for the first weather, the bumpers and the headlines, and we have to write all of that stuff. So it's a lot of writing throughout the day. To take you back to one of your first questions there about writing, it's a lot of writing. People think that, oh yeah, Hutchins just shows up at 10 to 6 in a limo and he gets his latte and he's in the studio. It's like, yeah, right. We start around 11 in the morning and we start writing and doing lineup. Sometimes that lineup changes dramatically because of events that happen throughout the day, right? So it has to be a fluid newscast.
Yeah.
Sometimes it changes during the newscast because it is a live newscast. So we spend a lot of our day coordinating, lining up, gathering, talking with the reporters, writing up smaller stories, copy stories, police stories, whatever. And we put that together, and of course it has to time out. You can't start 2 minutes late in a newscast, and you can't finish 2 minutes late. Advertisers won't like that, and the next show that comes along won't like that either. So you have to start on time, and you have to finish on time down to the second every single day. So, there's a lot that goes into that, and I certainly enjoy it, and I know my colleagues do. Sometimes, I'm not going to lie, it is a grind. It's tough because you start with a clean slate every day. Mm-hmm. Every day. We might have an idea of what we're going to cover, but we don't know some stories fall through for whatever reason. So you might start off with the best laid plans, but they might fall apart that day, and you've got to find something else to replace it. You can't go to air at 6 o'clock and say, there's no news today. Have a good night. You have to fill an hour, whether you like it or not. Some days it's easy peasy. It's natural. There's lots going on. Other days it's like you're scraping the bottom to find stories that you think are of interest, and it's just like you get them. They're slow news days.
Yeah, exactly. Some things that haven't changed is the look of the local news broadcast, and it seems to apply to stations right across North America. I can't speak for stations outside that particular geographical boundary, but it's the news anchor or anchors, and you have a weather person and you have a sports person, and sometimes there's interaction between the three of them or the four of them, depending upon how many there are in the studio. That format seems to have been fairly consistent over the years. Obviously, it works.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I enjoy that part of the interaction. So it's not just the presentation of the news or the presentation of the weather or sports, but there's interaction between our colleagues, myself and the colleagues who work at the TV station. And I enjoy that part. I think viewers do too. I hope so. Where you try to pry some reasons as to why it's raining 7 days in a row from our weather person, or you're bantering about something,
or what to do with all the pizza that's left over.
Yes, well, the chats range, and they have over the years. I mean, there are times we had bats in the studio. I don't know how they got in. We had a raccoon in the studio once, and during a newscast. Let's say you're ducking and reading at the same time. Yes, because the show must go on, and it's sometimes it's hilarious. I mean, you can look back now and say that. At the time, it's like, am I going to get rabies reading the news tonight? And it's a lot of, it's fun, but in a professional way. It's fun. We have I can say honestly that we pretty much all get along, both off the air and on the air. Hopefully that translates among viewers. So there's a camaraderie there, and we've developed it over the years. I hope there's there's a connection that we can make with viewers, and there's a chemistry, I think, as well there that you develop over time. You don't just start and say, force a chemistry. I'm sure you've heard or seen in the past about things that just they don't get along, and it shows.
Yeah.
That is not the case with us. And so, I mean, the look has evolved. I mean, as society has, as wardrobes and hair have. But you're right. The basics of that look and how we structure the show has been pretty much unchanged since I started there, all those years ago. It's still the same kind of format, right? And if it's working, why mess with it? Why blow it up, right? And
you still have to wear a tie.
Yes, I still have to wear a tie. There are days where, especially when it's hot and humid out, it's like, oh, do I really have to wear this tie? And a jacket, and I like to look. And in fact, the company expects that too. I mean, it's part and parcel of what you do. You want to look presentable. Sometimes it may seem over the top. It's like you're watching in your t-shirt and shorts at home, and why is he wearing a tie and a pocket square? And but that comes with the job, right? I mean, it's like, why do you ask a police officer to wear a uniform? Well, it's part of their job. This is part of our job to look the part. And I enjoy that. And it's just, the tie width has changed over the years. I'll tell you that much. And the collars.
And you still have all those ties.
Well, you know what? I am a bit of a pack rat like that because I think, this is going to come back in style. And you know what? Sure enough, there was a time when thin ties were not in style. Okay, and I held on to mine, and they came back. There are other things, like some things they just don't fit you anymore because of different reasons. But you know what? It's all part of what we do, and we try to look as presentable as we can, professional as we can. That's part of the job, because I think it helps us in our own credibility. Not only in what we say, but how we present it. You want to come off as being trustworthy, and I hope we do that. I sincerely try for that anyway, every day. And I enjoy it. I mean, I have a blast doing that. And it's something it's a passion for me. I'm glad I found this career, which I've wanted for a long, long time, even before, long before 40 years, that I said, I want to be in TV. I want to do that job. And I'm very fortunate that I have been able to do it for all these years.
Now, besides doing this job, which you love, you are also someone who does writing on the side that has nothing to do with television. And you've written for local periodicals. And where did that come from? Is this just something you wanted to do? It's
a little of column A, a little of column B. I mean, I enjoy writing. I think with writing, when you put it in print, whether it's magazine or newspaper format or digital, you can tell more of the story. In TV, you've got 8-second sound bites. You've got up to 2 minutes to tell a story, and sometimes you just can't capture all of what needs to be said. We do our best, but then in print, you can go on and on and on. You put more quotes, more context, and things like that. So that's one thing I do enjoy is presenting more information on a story to people. And I've been doing that since I think pretty much since I got here. I covered city council for 30 years, and don't you see the lines on my face to prove that?
Staying up late at
Hey,
night.
oh, geez, yeah. Some really long nights of mayors, starting with Helen Cooper on. So I always enjoyed covering City Hall, though. Not a lot of people do. I don't know why. Maybe they find the meetings boring, long-winded, no decisions being made. But I always liked that. It was something that was interested me. And so I do a lot of writing about municipal politics. And because I think that is the closest form of certainly democracy to people in this community. Yes, we have MPPs at Queen's Park. Yes, we have area MPs in Ottawa, and their decisions might seem important, but they're also far away. But what happens at City Hall could affect you directly and a lot sooner. And they're a lot more accountable because they're right there.
Yeah.
And so I always found that to be more interesting than the senior levels of government, the coverage of what happens down at City Hall. So I do a lot of writing about that. And, just to be perfectly honest, raising a couple of kids, I needed the extra money. It was a side hustle, and I just kept doing it. I enjoyed it.
You mentioned social media as a source for stories from time to time. Going forward, do you have a sense as to where social media fits when you look at it as a tool for local news?
I worry sometimes that it's going to take over for local news. And, I mean, we've already seen evidence of that recently with widespread cuts in conventional broadcast media. And I don't think they're going to stop. I think that's going to continue, unfortunately. Do I have a crystal ball that can predict? All I can do is hope that people still see. We're appointment viewing, right? At 6 o'clock, people tune in at 6 o'clock. If I can speak for my show, they tune in to watch us at 6. Well, you don't have to wait till 6 o'clock anymore to get your day's dose of news when it's available everywhere, online, all the time. On social media, right? So you can get that news instantly now. You don't have to wait until 6 o'clock anymore. And so I worry that over time, if people gravitate to that too much, it could erode our viewers. And what is our purpose then? We're telling news that's already kind of old news. It's already out there. It's not new anymore, other than the way we present it. But yeah, it's. I hope that it doesn't, because social media, for all the good that it is, it can also be very hard on people. In fact, a lot of people are leaving social media because of the hatred and just there's so much being spewed out there.
Bullying and stuff like that.
All of it, yeah. And a lot of it directed at journalists now too.
Yeah.
So if that's what the future holds, I'll be sad if that's what we're left with at the end of the day, because conventional broadcasters can't make a go of it with enough advertising revenues. And we're left with that, or the giants like Google and Facebook to control what you see, what you read about, the flow of news. It's all done in such a high-level corporate thing, and it's not even in Canada anymore. They will decide what's news to you.
Yeah. Whereas
right now, we decide, and we live here. Okay, that's again gets back to the local thing. We don't only cover local news. We live here. We are residents here as well, our staff. And so that is important too, because what affects you affects me, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So the only difference is I can't give my opinion on how it affects me, but you can. So I hope that social media doesn't take over in the end, but I don't know where it's going. All I know is that it's happening. These changes are happening very rapidly.
That's right.
Even in the last 3 or 5 years.
I've interviewed a fair number of musicians and singers on this program, and a lot of them local.
I'm not going to sing.
Okay. Oh, thank goodness. I can't sing either. But a lot of what they think about and spend their time focused on is music that's in their head. And whether or not it means revenue, they will go into a studio and record an album and put it up on a streaming service, or actually make physical CDs. because they have to get it out of their head and onto a CD or onto a streaming service.
Yes.
So my question to you is there a book ruminating inside that head of yours that you need to get out at some point?
I've always thought about writing an autobiography or a semi-autobiography about, I don't know whether people would be interested in my career. I find it interesting. I find my mother's story very interesting and how she raised 3 kids on her own in the 60s, which was taboo back then. And by the way, she was a lumberjack up north. She's an amazing woman, worked in lumber camps, and she was a lumberjack, and she'd be hauling us through the forest as part of that in the wild 60s. Yes. Yeah. She was a workaholic. She worked 2 jobs to keep us from being given up to Children's Aid back then. So I give a lot of credit to my late mother for her work ethic, which I hope rubbed off on myself and my siblings. But beyond that, in my career, there are stories I have a lot of stories to tell, and I wish I could, and that would be a good form to do it in a book. Again, they're my stories. I don't know how juicy or interesting they may be to other people, because sometimes you're looking for the dirt on something, and and the bad stuff that maybe in your life, But if I ever did that, first of all, I'd need the time to do that. So maybe in retirement, I would probably call the book Of Mikes and Men. I always like that kind of play on words in that title, and it would be an autobiography.
Yeah, I think people are interested in how stories evolve, and you don't get the time to do that during your television newscast or even during a segment you might write for a magazine.
No.
But if you're involved in the story by reporting on it, some of what that reporting involves is some background information that you just don't have time to. And I know people like to read about that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, good. Well, thanks for setting me on to that particular angle. You're right. Background is important and context in a lot of things. And, it helps people picture things and again get more information like that. And I would have a few stories to tell about that for sure, both locally and also during my years in Toronto.
Well, listen, man, you do a good job. Thanks very much for your time today, and keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me in on the Kingstonian podcast here, and hopefully I didn't say anything that's going to get me in trouble, because I'm not ready to call it a career just yet, Dave. You take care.
Okay, bye-bye. Our guest in this episode, Bill Hutchins, news anchor for CKWS-TV, and you can catch him weeknights on Global News Kingston at 6 p.m. The conversation was recorded in June of 2023. To those of you who have taken the time to listen, thank you, and I'll be back soon.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to the KingstonianPodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.